I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to The Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. Today is Thursday, February 2nd, 2023. And today we hang out with friends. I call them companions. I call us a group of companions, people sort of headed down the same track, looking for freedom, looking for accountability, responsibility, looking to be our authentic selves as we work as we do and where we do for personal improvement, for improvement in our community and improvement in the world. Work, I think, with the sense of feeling that the work is worthwhile and that we're equal to the task. So let me say, first of all, if you're listening on any of the several social media platforms, if you're on Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook, I want you to go over to YouTube, the Insight channel on YouTube. We're trying to grow our subscriber base. We've got around a little less than 300 right now. Our target is 1,000 subscribers to the YouTube channel. And what I want you to do is take a minute, either right now or before or at the end of the program, and click on to the Conversation with Al McFarlane on the Insight YouTube channel. Subscribe, like it, and share it. And just as a matter of course, we want you to tell people that we're here every week. We're having great conversations. And the idea is that we elevate and celebrate our own voices. We celebrate our own vision. We trust ourselves to provide accurate, insightful analysis of the world that we see, and also a clear description of the world we seek to build. Well, I want to start today by taking a minute for what we call the hot topics. And today I just got a note from U.S. Representative Ilhan Omar. It's a form that she sent out to probably a lot of her subscribers, but it's important because she's saying that it happened, that she has been kicked off of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. That's been in the news for several days. You can see it on CNN. We'll play a part of the clip, but before we play that, let's hear part of what she had to say in her note to her supporters and community today. And the note that she entitled, "After 4 proud years of service, I was just removed from the House Foreign Affairs Committee." She says, "I want to be perfectly clear. This political stunt is a personal one. It's the result of years of xenophobic, Islamophobic, and racist attacks that started the moment I was elected." She says the far right spent millions of dollars in campaign ads against our movement, stoking fear and division, and a constant stream of hateful and violent rhetoric has led to hundreds of death threats against me and my family. That's Ilhan Omar's voice. And what she's saying continues, "Now in their latest move, they've attempted to silence my voice and began undoing the incredible progress our movement has helped make both at home and abroad." She says in typical Ilhan Omar style, with a certain audacity and fierceness, "I'm here to tell you that's not going to happen." She says, "My commitment to justice for all people across the globe, no matter their race, religion, nationality, or anything else, does not begin or end with a committee assignment." Well, that sounds like Omar to me. I've watched her career from being a community organizer, a young person emerging into the Minnesota House of Representatives and emerging from there to the U.S. House of Representatives. And she's done it with a sense of audacity and a sense of destiny as well. She's living her purpose and her dream. And let's check out what she said. I think the CNN has a clip. We'll check that out real quickly.
An American. What opinions do we have to be counted as Americans? This is what this debate is about, Madam Speaker. There is this idea that you are a suspect if you are an immigrant, or if you are from certain parts of the world, or a certain skin tone, or a Muslim. It is no accident that members of the Republican Party accuse the first Black President Barack Obama of being a secret Muslim. It is no accident that former President Donald Trump led a birther movement that falsely claimed he was born in Kenya. Because to them, falsely labeling the first and only president of the United States of America a Muslim and African immigrant somehow made him less American. Well, I am Muslim. I am an immigrant, and interestingly, from Africa. Is anyone surprised that I am being targeted? Is anyone surprised that I am somehow deemed unworthy to speak about American foreign policy? Or that they see me as a powerful voice that needs to be silenced? Frankly, it is expected, because when you push power, power pushes back. Representation matters. Continuing to expand our ideas of who is American and who can partake in the American experiment is a good thing. I am an American who was sent here, by her constituents to represent them in Congress, a refugee who survived the horrors of a civil war, someone who spent her childhood in a refugee camp, someone who knows what it means to have a
I think, that's Ilhan Omar, and that's classic Ilhan Omar style and substance. Let me turn to my colleague today, Kamal King, former lawyer with Coca-Cola Corporation, a businessman, a classmate of mine. Kamal and I have been friends since we were in the third grade, I think, in Kansas City. Kamal, good afternoon. Welcome to the conversation. What do you make of that speech and of this story?
It reminded me of how Martin Luther King was treated, how anyone who stands up, as she says, to power is treated. You know, you're a threat. I think that it was J. Edgar Hoover, who at that time was the head of the FBI, who said that Martin Luther King was the most dangerous Negro in the world. And it's the same scenario repeating itself. That's what that reminded me of.
Dr. Irma McFarlane is here. Dr. McFarlane, good afternoon. So good to see you. I don't think we've talked in the past few days anyway, at least on the program, but it's always good to have you back here. What's your impression of the way Ilhan Omar, and you may know her, I'm not sure if you do or not, but what's your impression of this train of events going on with her being removed from that committee?
Well, I think it's as she pointed out, is that there's a targeting going on. It's not surprising. And I think this is an attempt by people to shape a kind of a legislative or political agenda the way that they want to. The question is, why aren't Democrats up in arms? Why aren't those Republicans who understand that, first of all, most Republicans are the children of immigrants. There are no indigenous white people to the Americas. So all of them came from someplace else at some point in time and are the descendants of immigrants. And so it's very interesting that if you're a white immigrant, a European immigrant, a Ukrainian immigrant, it's okay. But if you are a Black immigrant, a Haitian immigrant, an immigrant of color, then you're not okay. And I think we have to keep calling this out as Omar does. I did not have an opportunity to meet her, but I've certainly followed her career. She is eloquent, she is elegant, and they quite don't know what to do with her because she's not going to stand and let them just do whatever they want.
And she has said and continues to say that she's been the object of several death threats.
Yes.
So she is aware that threats like that are not made idly in this country. I mean, the record
That's
shows
right.
the danger is real. And
And the fact that it hasn't taken up as real until it's too late says something about the structures that be, that they're not there to protect us. We may become a part of them, we may intervene and intercede and be able to participate, but they were never designed to protect us. And so we always have to be cautious. We always have to be on the offensive and not just the defensive. And we always have to know that even the people who sit beside us may not be our friends, even if they're our colleagues.
Let me bring a new partner in. W.D. Foster Graham is the book review editor for Inside News. And towards the end of this conversation, we're going to ask him to talk about what he's reading and things he'd recommend. And all of us are going to share what's on our reading table at the present time. The idea is to keep elevating the power and the joy and the knowledge that we gain and share by practicing reading, and to have that conversation publicly as well, so that it becomes the end thing. What am I reading? What are you reading? And we have fun in sharing that. But WD, rather good to see you, and feel free to jump in anywhere. You're here in Minnesota with me, and I don't know if you followed this story in particular, but you may have an impression.
Well, my impression of it is that this is not a new story.
Right.
It's been going on since we were brought here, and that and then it's also about how she was treated. It's about those persons in those systems that are only interested in holding on to power. And then Ilhan Omar, she's a person say, I'm here, deal with it. You're not going to push me around. And we see that generations back with the in the days of civil rights movement. With persons such as Martin Luther King, Fannie Lou Hamer, for example, which was a topic of a book that I just reviewed. But that's where I see where this is going. But the key is we always have to remain vigilant. We have to continue to speak up. As it was just mentioned earlier, we're continually on the offensive.
Great. Well, I want to move on and talk about another thing that I call one of our hot topics today, and that is the story of the Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, dubbed America's first Black pop star. I've got an article that is written by Adam Gustafson, who's an instructor in music at Penn State. The article says that in 1851, a concert soprano named Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield embarked on a national tour that upended America's music scene. In antebellum America, operatic and concert songs were very popular forms of entertainment. European concert sopranos such as Jenny Lind, Catherine Hayes drew huge crowds and rave reviews during their U.S. tours. Lind was so popular that baby cribs still bear her name, and you can now visit an unincorporated community called Jenny Lind, California. Greenfield, however, was different. She was once enslaved, and she was performing songs that a burgeoning field of American music criticism led by John Sullivan Dwight considered reserved for white artists. African American artists, most of the 19th century critics argued, lacked the refined cultivation of white Eurocentric genius and could create only simple music that lacked artistic depth. It was a prejudice that stretched as far back as Thomas Jefferson in his Notes on the State of Virginia, and was later refined by minstrel shows. Well, let me go to you, Dr. Irma. This is culture and a reflection of how culture exists and works, both to empower and to deny power, recognition, definition of people. I don't know if you've seen the notes in this story already, but even with that, what thoughts, impressions, Dr. Irma, do you have?
Well, one is that the history of the contributions of Black Americans to the Americas, and particularly to the United States or North America, runs very deep and very consistently. Whether it is the story, there's a book called, or I think a video called The Librarian and a Banjo, where a white librarian sets out to prove that the banjo is not an Appalachia instrument, but actually is African. Its origins are African. And so I think what we have to understand is part of the agenda about not letting an AP African American Studies course, the Woke Act, as DeSantis is calling it in Florida, which is legislation to ban or to try and block knowledge from being presented in schools, is really an attempt to what I call white-splain or whitewash American history once again. Now, we've already been there. So I think the more that we tell these stories and show and prove to our youth that our history and our foundation in this country is really at the beginning of its origins, and that there cannot be an America without a Black America, without an Indigenous America, and without immigrants, because the people who claim to have founded it, as a colony were not the first people, but they were all immigrants. So any kind of anti-immigrant legislation is really ignoring the reality of the past. And this woman represents the contributions. And I think the more that we tell these stories, both contemporary like Omar and historical, then the better things will be.
Let me read some more of the article. It says, when Greenfield appeared on the scene, she shattered pre-existing beliefs about artistry and race. Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, and the subsection is called The Black Swan, was born into slavery in Natchez, Mississippi around 1820. As a girl, she was taken to Philadelphia and raised by an abolitionist. Largely self-taught as a singer, she began her concert career in New York with the support of the Buffalo Musical Association. In Buffalo, she was given the nickname the Black Swan, a crude attempt to play off the popularity of Jenny Lind, who was known as the Swedish Nightingale, and who was wrapping up one of the most popular concert tours in the history of America. In 1851, Colonel Joseph H. Wood became Greenfield's promoter, and however, he was an overt racist and inhumane promoter, known for creating wonderment museums in Cincinnati and Chicago that featured exhibits like the Lilliputian King, a boy who stood 16 inches tall. With Greenfield, he sought to replicate that success that another promoter, P.T. Barnum, had with Jenny Lind. In a letter to Frederick Douglass, Martin R. Delaney, a physician, newspaper editor, and Civil War hero, wrote that Wood was a fervent supporter of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and would not admit Black patrons into his museums or at Greenfield's concerts. It goes on. And so to me, again, Dr. Irma, this is another story that is a testament to the overcoming power, the transcending power, the delimiting or capability of our people to break through limitations and to continue to move towards our authentic truth, our authentic selves, despite opposition from the powerful and the cultural chauvinists. What do you think?
Well, we have to understand that the ideology of racism and white supremacy was rooted fundamentally in a belief that Blacks were subhuman, that we were not of the human species. And that begins with the Enlightenment, the great chain of beings, where on the one hand you have angels, on the other hand you have humans, and then with humans there are hierarchy. And of course, Black people are at the very lowest rung. So the idea that we can be extraordinary, that we have these talents, really continues to challenge this idea that somehow we're not human. And the irony is that we are still bumping up against that belief, that white supremacist belief in modern times, in contemporary times, in this millennium. I've bumped up against it where people, they hear my voice, they don't know that I don't sound Black to them. They see my last name, they make assumptions about who I am, and then I walk into a room and there's this surprise, like I'm not supposed to be there. And I think that that's continuous because it is rooted in a fundamental belief, not fact, but a fundamental belief that somehow we're not of the same species, that we're not the same people. And even Thomas Jefferson made a comment at one point in one of his speeches that you may teach him Latin and, to the numbers, but all you've done is to take a savage and turn him into a dangerous beast. I actually like being dangerous. And, we don't have to own what other people call us, but this is what it comes from, this shock and surprise.
Let me pivot here and talk about something that's current in the news, but it's all related. Let's do a review of Tyre Nichols. I've got a piece up by the Associated Press reporters Aaron Morrison and Claudia Lauer and Adrian Sands. The story headline reads, Tyre Nichols' case revives calls for change in police culture. And it's a Memphis dateline from the 29th, so a couple of days old. But it says, it starts off, and we've heard this already, an unarmed black man dies after a videotaped beating by police. The officers involved are fired. After a thorough review of the evidence, criminal charges are swiftly filed against the offending officers. Investigation, accountability, and charges. This is often the most Black citizens can hope for as the deaths continue. Nationwide, police have killed roughly 3 people per day consistently since 2020, according to academics and advocates for police reform who track such deaths. Tyre Nichols' fatal encounter with police officers in Memphis, Tennessee, recorded in video made public a Friday night, that's before this article was printed, is a glaring reminder that efforts to reform policing have failed to prevent more flashpoints in an intractable epidemic of brutality. The story goes on to talk about this in the context of Rodney King's savage beating by police some 32 years ago, and that this incident sort of repeats itself, punctuated by deaths of Amadou Diallo in New York, of Oscar Grant in Oakland, California, obviously Michael Brown in Ferguson, and many others. It says that George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis in 2020 was so agonizing to watch, it summoned a national reckoning that featured federal legislation proposed in his name and shows of solidarity by corporations and sports leagues. All, however, fell short of the shift in law enforcement culture Black people in America have called for, a culture that promotes freedom from fear, trust in police, and mutual respect. Well, Kamal, let me ask you to weigh in here. Just as you, over the course of days, once again look at this rough interaction between law enforcement in our community, what do you think? You and I have talked about this before because I've asked you. I'm here in Minnesota, fairly small Black population, and from here, I often wonder, is the relationship between community and law enforcement different in places like Detroit or Chicago or DC? And my idyllic concern, I think it's a naive concern, is the belief that because there are more Black people, there's going to be more fairness. That may not be true. How do you assess this, Kamal King?
I believe that there's a culture among police, and it goes back to what Dr. Ehrman was saying. They are white supremacists, and the police grew out of what they call patty rollers, people who were chasing slaves, ex-slaves, or Black people. And this is a continuation of that. Here you have Black policemen who have bought into this culture. And it's the same as when Emmett Till was killed. I didn't realize that there were Black people who helped kidnap him until I watched that movie Till, and saw that there were Black people who went into that, who were there when those white guys killed Emmett Till, and helped them, snitched on him. And it's a continuation.
Pointed him out, right?
Yeah, help pointing them out, and we're in the wagon, and with the white people. Thank God. And the same way, just because a person is Black, has a black skin, and if you go to Africa, you will really see that just because a person has a black skin doesn't necessarily mean that they are for African Americans or Africans. You know, it's a cultural buy-in. The same way that because Clarence Thomas has a black skin doesn't necessarily mean he's going to promote the same type of program that Thurgood Marshall promoted. Thank God in this case, the black police chief, a woman black police chief, said no, and she's the one who insisted and took a different course. Otherwise, I believe it may have been the same kind of nonsense. The film would never come out until 6 months or 7 months later. So there's a culture among police that they believe that black people, they know that we're vulnerable, and they believe that they can pretty much do anything they want to us.
Did the chief come out of Atlanta? Where was she before?
She had been in Atlanta. She had been in Atlanta.
What was her story there? Do you remember? Because what I got was a report that she had not really maintained the trust of the community there, but I may have.
There was an incident, and I read about it. Just two or 3 days ago. There was an incident in which the powers that be didn't like the way that she had behaved in that incident, and it kind of like, you know, once you one bad deed can wipe out 20 that are boys. And she had this one incident that the powers that be didn't like, and so she moved on. But as we see in this particular instance, she stood up and she pointed out, you know, she brought it to the forefront right away. You know.
Brother Foster Graham, your thoughts, your impressions.
Well, I've only heard so much about about what happened with Tyre, just from bits and pieces I saw in the news. But you know, when it came up, you know, memories came about what happened with Rodney King, and of course, most recently George Floyd, which is reminding us that, you know, the police culture is still a product of systemic racism. And I think of a quote, okay, they're supposed to be our watchdogs to serve and protect, but who's watching the watcher?
Irma?
May I you know, in South Africa, during the apartheid, black policemen treated Africans just as bad as the white police in South Africa. And that's when, you may remember, they had they started the necklace where they put a tire around them,
set it afire,
tire around their head, and set the tire on fire. Well, that was their remedy for the black police who were enforcing apartheid. That's what I'm seeing here. This, you know, a lot of these black policemen, you just because you got a black cop, I tell my kids and I tell myself, I treat them with respect. I speak into that microphone that they wear right here. Yes, sir. No, sir. But in Tyre's case, it didn't matter because he said, you know, you guys are going kind of overboard here.
Well, there's the other part that is coming up, that he may have been involved with the former girlfriend of one of those 5 officers. So there may have been another agenda operating under the cover of the traditional perception of how cops in general disregard and disrespect black people, but another motive may have been at play as well simultaneously. So it makes it complicated. Irma, what do you think?
Well, as an anthropologist, I think we have to understand that simply because someone puts on a uniform does not mean that they've somehow eradicated all of their biases and prejudices. And when you join a group, I call it the Jim Jones syndrome, okay? People follow Jim Jones to death. And part of it, drinking that social cultural Kool-Aid, means that you take on certain kinds of perspectives and characteristics. Whether it is about police violence against the community, whether police are using the power that they've been given to satisfy certain kinds of personal vendettas. And, it could be a girlfriend, it could be any number of things. Remember the case in Texas where the officer walked into the wrong room, the wrong apartment, is that she was talking to her police boyfriend, a colleague who was married, on the phone. She wasn't paying attention, and someone died as a result of that. So I think we have to stop thinking that somehow, because people have been trained, that somehow they are able to escape from their personal flaws and characteristics. And we see this group mentality when we look at fraternities. If we look at hazing, what happens? People who seem to be quote unquote good people do some horrific kinds of things because they want to be part of a group. So there's something about that group mentality. But what I wanted to add to this was to just take a moment
Yes.
and remind you that in 2014, I wrote the piece, A Black Mother Weeps for America, Stop Killing Our Black Sons. And this is what I said: no domestic tranquility for our Black sons. They are not insurgents. They are not enemy combats. They are not hostile enemy forces. They are not terrorists. They are our Black sons. And I beg you, America, stop killing them in their own backyards, in the streets outside of nightclubs, on the phone talking to their girlfriends, and a few blocks from a convenience store from which they may or may not have taken stolen cigars. They do not deserve to die for such trivial incidents. Stop it. And I think this is another example. If in fact the motivation for this was personal, then it even makes it far worse. This is truly an abuse of power. And I think we are asking that these institutions that were designed to protect really have to come under great scrutiny, how they're being trained, whether it's the education they're getting in criminal justice, whether it's the police academy. But there is a huge gap between what they're supposed to be doing and what they actually do. And it's not just them. Okay, it's not just this one incident. It doesn't just happen to Black people, but we are by far the largest victims of this kind of, I would say, police out of control.
I think about the layers associated with this case in particular, and I brought up the issue of whether this was a personal situation or infused with a personal vendetta. And what I was referring to is the reports that the woman in Tyre Nichols' life was the former either girlfriend or significant other of one of the 5 officers. And therefore, it's almost like a gang sticking up for one of the boys who feels he has been dissed and meeting punishment to the offender, in this case, Tyre Nichols. If that is the case, if that is in fact the case, the layers include these. Number one, abusing the power of life and death, the power and the authority of policing, the legal power that they possess to take a life, abusing that for personal motivations. If that's one thing. But the second thing is to do it in the context. I mean, they, like everybody else, have to be aware of the reckoning unfolding around the country, particularly around George Floyd. And I think today is the anniversary of the shooting of the young man here in Minneapolis, today or this week, who the squad, the special unit, broke into in a hotel and shot and killed this young man who wasn't the one they were after with their warrant. He happened to be there and happened to have a gun, which he was legally authorized to have, but he was asleep. They saw the gun, they killed him. And so these officers have to be aware of all of the countries and all of the world's focus on police conduct and the world's expectation that police genuinely think and do better as they execute their responsibility. But somehow there's a brazenness that is almost forgetful. Or you could say that some of the things that they did, they might have felt would not be reported, because some of them, I understand, move their body cams this way and moved it that way. But as it turned out, there was a sky camera that the police department had that had a wider, longer, better view, and an inaccurate view that they couldn't control. So they knew that the country is concerned about responsible policing, accountable policing, and yet they acted in this manner. And was it in part the idea that, with immunity, they could say anything, report anything, and expect people to buy it? In effect, that these black cops think they could do what white cops do all the time and get away with it. So, Kamal, what do you think?
I believe that it's a continuation of white supremacy. There have been enough incidents now in the last 10 years that if anything should be removed, is this qualified immunity that police have. That should be off the, if they are outright wrong, they should be able to be charged, and charged personally. This qualified immunity should be gone. But the European Americans who came here, one of my professors, Hakeem Mutabute, said, worst enemy ever. Worst enemy ever. This whole, the subject that we started off with about the lady who was singing, that, and what Dr. Ehrman said, they didn't want to believe that we could sing. They didn't want to believe that we could play baseball. They didn't want to believe that we could read or write. And like Dr. Ehrman said, even Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, had the same attitude, and it's a continuation of that attitude. But let me read this, just 4 lines. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may tread me in the very dirt, but still like dust I rise.
Rise, that's right.
And this Sunday, not this Sunday, but Sunday next, you're going to see 2 black quarterbacks in the Super Bowl, a position that they said we wasn't able to play. Now you got 2, and it's changed the whole dynamics of that position. Still I rise.
Good comment. Wonderful. While we're talking about police, let me switch to Atlanta, Kamal, and back to our hometown, Kansas City. I have an article pulled up here that is called What is Cop City? How Opposition to an Atlanta Police Center Prompted National Demonstrations. And the subhead is that officials plan to build an 85-acre, $90 million training facility through an Atlanta forest. And that is despite fierce public opposition. I came across this a couple of days or a week ago watching the Daily Show, Trevor Noah's Daily Show. And I think this was, I'm not sure who was hosting at that time, might have been Leslie Jones, might have been Trevor, but Roy, what's Roy's name? The commentator on the show, and I'll think of his name in a second, but he does commentary and comedy together, had a segment on Cop City, and it basically showed people that are doing the wilderness kind of living, camping out in the forest and working to actively sabotage the police development of this property into their training facility. And while he was interviewing some of the cops that were on the scene, there was an explosion at one of the fences. I don't know if it was staged or not, could have been staged, but the suggestion was that the resistance was actually doing things like sabotage, like bombing fences to deter, slow down the police action there. And he interviewed a couple of the squatters as well. It was interesting. But let me read this article, part of it by Shar Adams. And Shar Adams writes that what began as peaceful protests and a vigil in Atlanta honoring a slain activist ended in property damage and several arrests Saturday. This article was written on January 26th, so it's a few days old here. The chaotic night came after nearly 2 years of organizers and activists imploring city leaders raising awareness and protesting the city's plans to build a sprawling police training center in a forest near Atlanta. Open quote, we've tried everything. We went through city council. We've taken the legislative route. We've done tons of advocacy. We've sent in letters, and we've all been responded, and all we've been responded with is force, said Matthew Johnson, a supporter of Defend the Atlanta Forest, one of the movements opposing plans for the new Atlanta Public Safety Training Center. He says, this wasn't just people breaking stuff to be breaking stuff. This was people who've run out of all options. Keisha Lance Bottoms, who was the mayor of Atlanta from 2018 to 2022, and is now in the Biden administration, has defended the project, saying in September 2021 that the forested land was the only viable option for the location of such a facility. Well, Kamal, you there in Atlanta, give us more of the pros and cons, the background on this facility and the angst that is emerging. We're not hearing about people that support it. Maybe you know that side of the story as well.
It's not about the forest. It's not about the trees. Mm-hmm. It's about the continual militarization of the police. Mm-hmm. That's what it's about. You know, firing ranges with high-powered guns. It's the continued militarization of the police. That's what this thing is about. And that's why people from all over the nation are coming. The people in the neighborhood are actually afraid. That's why they're not, you know, they just kind of staying away, because the people who are coming are really militant in the true sense of the word.
Coming to protest, yeah. Yasmin, thanks.
I mean,
that was Roy Wood Jr. that did the piece on the Daily Show that brought it to my attention. Yeah.
You know, bringing in tanks. It's the militarization of the police, which I think the country needs to really take a look at.
Kamal, you and I grew up on 28th in Brooklyn, 29th in Brooklyn, where you grew up, but in the area just 3 blocks towards downtown from where we grew up. I understand there's been a massive elimination of housing and other property for the construction of another version of the same thing. I haven't been to Kansas City myself in a long, long time. I don't know if you have, but you might be aware of what happened there and what the concerns and whether they are parallel in some way to what residents and communities are saying in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Yeah, their police center was built right in the middle of the Black community. Mm-hmm. You know, it's like a fort.
And let's think about the connection between the building of such a facility, which is clearly to militarize, to train people to be military ready, as opposed to community ready.
Right.
And the prison industrial complex. This is being built for us. This is being built to train police how to, in fact, treat us and abuse us and make us the fodder for a prison industrial complex. And I think we have to look that these two are not disconnected. One of the things I wanted to point out in the earlier story, that we talked about police brutality and they having their agenda and the abuse of power. What we didn't talk about is that the fact that this policeman thought that he could use his power to subdue a woman. In other words, he's taking this is domestic violence as well. And it's about patriarchy and male power. You know, so all of these things are tied up together, and people do not leave their culture at the door. They do not leave their ideologies at the door when they become policemen. And we have to really recognize that people come with biases. They come with certain values and beliefs about who is legitimate, who is human, who is not human, who is worthy of their protection. And all of that cannot be trained out of them, because the training itself reinforces some of these negative beliefs.
And so, Dr. Irma, how do we sort of continue to both personally and collectively offer a counter a different narrative, a different orientation. We've heard the language of reimagining policing, and at one point in time, or at some point in time, the quote unquote powers of be poo-poo that and suggest that that's just wistful thinking and there's no substance behind that. How do we keep from being relegated to irrelevance? And if we have a genuine argument to make about how justice and security are upheld, how do we keep that idea going forward against the power of the institution, against the power of money, against the power of interest that benefit from our continued marginalization and powerlessness?
Wow, big question.
Wow, yes. Someone else jump in too. I mean, I think, you know, Jose Marti talked about being in the belly of the monster. We are always in the belly of the monster. And those of us who reach positions of power, I think we call on them to do the right thing. I don't think we need to reimagine the police until we reimagine the criminal law, criminal justice curriculum that they're being fed. Okay, that curriculum is based on a deficit model. So instead of going to the police, let's go to the University of Minnesota or other institutions that offer a program in criminal justice and say, what exactly are you teaching these people? What are the values? What is the perspective that you're giving them? Does this particular curriculum position Black people as always less than and always the target and always the criminal? If so, then get rid of that curriculum. Let's reimagine how they're being taught first in their schools before they even get to the police academy. I think, you know, we start wherever we can. We find entry points wherever we can. We find allies wherever we can. Yeah. But still, we have to rise. We can't, just because power is there, doesn't mean that we give up our hopes and walk away. I think we have to keep pushing back, pushing forward, pushing until it keeps moving, even if it's a little bit, maybe not in our time, but in the future. I think we have to keep writing about it. I think Black newspapers and these kinds of shows are critical because we don't know what children are going to be getting in schools. I think archives are important so that the information about someone like that Black, you know, swan is preserved, and we know that we've done amazing and remarkable things despite having been in the midst of oppression.
Kamal, you were thinking about this as well?
Yeah, you have to keep truth. I think keep truth and humanity at the forefront. You know, arguments based on truth and humanity, they have to be at the forefront. And even though people will say, well, you know, they're criminals and blah, 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 you have to show that, no, not all people are criminals. You know, generalizations will not do. Just keep truth at the forefront and speak up when you have an opportunity to speak up.
Before I shift, I want to ask both you and Dr. Irma, and maybe WD, if this applies to you as well. I know the two of you are international travelers, and you watch what's happening in the world. And as we have these discussions here, Kamal, you refer to the same kind of abuse of power in South Africa, but it wasn't by the Black officers that supported apartheid regime and power. And Irma, I know that you spend a lot of time in South and Central America looking at culture and how people approach defining themselves differently. What's the connection right now that we have the ability to talk to each other around the world through the digital technology? We used to say that, I used to read that Brazil, for example, in terms of civil rights and human rights work, could be described as 20 years behind North America, Black people leading the movement globally for civil rights and human rights. I don't know that that's still the case. I think that stuff is happening throughout the diaspora at a breakneck pace, and that's a good thing. But the resistance is also there, solidifying and continuing to find ways to permanize the power of the minority and to extract from the majority of the world. Dr. Irma, what do you think as a person who's observed on the world scene?
I think it's a mistake for us to always use ourselves as a point of reference in comparing things, because we then center ourselves as if, and that's the Americanization, where we always think we're the center of the universe. Every country has its own history. And while they may borrow from us or look to us, and we may borrow from them, because, the rebellions were happening in Cuba back in the, when they were trying to get independence from Spain, led by people like, Antonio Maceo, who was a mulatto, whose, parents had been enslaved. And so I think we need to say, what can we learn from other struggles? But at the end of the day, it's what happens here that matters for us. And then we should support and promote what is happening in other places, so that we understand, one, we are not alone. This is not a United States movement against anti-Blackness and policing. This is not a Brazil movement. It is an African diaspora movement. And then we have to look to Africa to say, how are you making your country better? Because there's a lot of abuse that's happening in African countries to Africans. And so somehow global capitalism has really informed and infused the way in which power is exercised and abused. And at that point, it doesn't matter what the skin color is, because it's about power, it's about privilege, it's about economic power and privilege. And so, and people who believe that power over is better than power to, that rather than empowering people to have a different kind of life, they'd rather have power over. And at some point, the people will rise up. Doesn't matter
Well,
what the
that's the
face
point
of it looks
you were
like.
making. I think it sounds like what you were saying as well.
Right. Ditto. It's, power is really colorless. It may come in different aspects or forms, but power wants to maintain itself. And it's just that here in America, color, the position that we find ourselves in is a lot of times based strictly on color. But in West Africa, for sure, pretty much everybody's the same color. You may not have the same marks on your face, and that makes a difference. You're coming from a different tribe. So, but power is what it is, and I still think the truth and humanity. You just have to just keep it out there. Truth and humanity.
And continuing to demand. I mean, Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. So we have to keep demanding justice.
And we got to keep reading. That's a great segue. I want to bring in Brother W.D. Foster Graham, Insights book review editor. And Brother W.D., what are you reading? What stories have you posted at insightnews.com or in the newspaper? And as you're talking, maybe Dr. Irma and Brother Kamal, you all can share what's on your book stand as well. W.D.?
Thanks, Al. Well, I think the latest 2 book reviews I've done definitely stuck with me. The first one was written by James Darnell Johnson, and it is a combination of fiction, fact, and fantasy. It's entitled Jamal and Me, Freedom Summer. So it takes place actually in the present. Jordan is the narrator of this story, who's 11 years old. He has a brother that's 2 years younger named Jamal. And the conversation eventually gets to, in their lives, about their great-grandmother, which name is Mary Jo Washington, and the fact that she was never able to register to vote. Mary Jo came from Mississippi, and the reason that she couldn't vote was because of the tactics that whites used to suppress voters. One of them was for literacy, that you had to guess the number of jelly beans in the jar, in order to be able to be registered. And she couldn't pass that test. As it stands, 9-year-old Jamal has that ability. He doesn't have to guess. He counts, and he keeps winning those contests over and over. So magic comes in. One night, he sees a butterfly queen named Queen Azima. And he has a wish that he could have seen his great grandmother. Well, guess what? She grants that wish that she can help his great grandmother to vote because of his skill with counting. So the key was that he and his brother and their dog Phoenix could not tell anyone that they were from the future. So with Queen Azima's magic, he goes back to 1964, Mississippi, Ruleville, Mississippi, during the Freedom Summer. And I love the way he draws the kind of the parallels in and has it through the lens of these young Black men, who in turn, actually, they meet Fannie Lou Hamer, who was one of those, our civil rights activists of that day, getting the Black vote, getting the Black registration, despite the oppressive environment and also dangerous in Mississippi during that time. And so they go to Freedom School, and they also see, the civil rights activists that are going around to help get Blacks to vote, both white and Black alike. They find out about the 3 civil rights workers who were murdered during that time. And
it sounds like a wonderful story. We're out of time, really, but thank you for that report. I mean, I love the way you're describing it too, because it really makes me want to get into it. And I think that talking about books is key. We got about a minute left. I'm going to ask Dr. Irma and Kamal, what are you reading right now, and what do you recommend? We have 1 minute altogether.
Well, I'm getting ready for the February 9th show, so I'm reading Re-Embracing Africa, and I'm going back and rereading Zora Neale Hurston's Barracoon as I stay here in Mobile.
Yeah, I just finished Uphill by Jamil Hill, who's a broadcaster. She was with ESPN, her autobiography, and now I'm reading Straight Shooter about Stephen A. Smith, his autobiography.
Awesome. And I just got a book a couple of days ago that says The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself. It's by a Japanese American. You might know him, Irma. David Mura, I think he's associated with the university, published by the...
No, David Mura went to college with me. He was class of 74. I'm class of 73. So I know David quite well. We actually started a writing workshop together. So yes, we're very proud of him. Good to know.
There we go.
What do you say the lies that white people tell?
Yep, The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself. The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself. And we're out of time. So listen, thank you so much. We'll see you next time. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane.